The Italian mob made a miscalculation. It was a rare thing for the Genovese crime family. Usually their math was perfect. They calculated odds like actuaries and collected debts like the IRS. But on this humid afternoon in August of 1940, they made a fatal error in judgment. They looked at Joe Louis and they saw a prize fighter. They saw a man who spoke slowly, who trusted easily, and who carried his cash in his front pockets instead of a bank vault. They looked at his simple demeanor and they mistook it for stupidity. They thought trapping the heavyweight champion of the world would be as easy as sliding a piece of paper across a desk. But their biggest mistake wasn't about the contract. It wasn't about the money. Their biggest mistake was thinking that because Joe Louis was alone in that room, he was unprotected. The room smelled of stale beer and expensive cologne. It was a small office on the third floor of a walk-up on West 125th Street, a neutral ground, or so, they said. Sitting across from the champ were three men who represented the financial interests of the mob, though they called themselves consultants. In the center was Vincent. He was smiling, but it was the kind of smile you see on a wolf right before it snaps its jaws. He was tapping a fountain pen against the desk. Tap, tap, tap. The sound echoed in the small room like a metronome counting down the seconds of Joe's freedom. To his left was Frank, a man with a neck thicker than a fire hydrant. Frank wasn't smiling. He was staring at Joe's hands, watching for a fist to clench, ready to reach for the pistol bulging under his armpit. And on the desk between them lay the weapon of choice. Not a gun, not a knife, a contract. They called it the Cotton Club expansion opportunity. It was a masterpiece of deception. They told Joe that for $50,000 cash up front, he would become a managing partner in the most famous nightclub in Harlem. They told him his name would be in lights, right next to Duke Ellington. They played on his vanity. They played on his fear of the future, the terrified whisper in every boxer's mind that asks, "What happens when I can't fight anymore?" But the contract wasn't a partnership. It was a death sentence for his finances. Buried in the legal gibberish on page 11 was a bust-out clause. It gave the partners total control over Joe's assets to cover operating losses. If Joe signed that paper, he wouldn't own a club. He would own the mob's debt. They could legally drain his fight purses, seize his properties, and turn the brown bomber into an indentured servant. "Time is ticking, champ," Vincent whispered. His voice was soft, like oil pouring over gravel. "Sugar Ray is waiting by the phone. He wants in. But we want you. We want a partner with class." The pressure was suffocating. It wasn't the threat of violence. Joe Louis could have killed all three of them with his bare hands before they cleared their holsters. It was the pressure of the deal, the fear of missing out, the desperate need to be seen as a businessman, not just a brute. Joe reached out. His hand, the hand that had knocked out Nazis and giants, was trembling ever so slightly. He picked up the gold-plated fountain pen. He uncapped it. He looked at the signature line. He took a breath that rattled in his chest. He lowered the nib to the paper. The black ink began to bleed into the fiber of the page. And then, the sound of the lock turning. Clack. It came from the door behind the mobsters. But nobody had knocked. Nobody had asked for permission to enter. The door handle turned slowly, deliberately. The heavy oak door swung inward, revealing the hallway darkness. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 20 degrees. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson stepped inside. He didn't look at Joe. He didn't say hello. He moved with the quiet confidence of a man who owns the pavement. He walks on. He turned his back to the room for a split second, a gesture of ultimate disrespect, and he locked the door from the inside. Click. He pulled the key out of the lock and dropped it into his breast pocket. Then he turned to face the three men in the pinstripe suits. Vincent's smile vanished. "Who the hell are you?" he barked, trying to sound like a boss. "This is a private meeting. Get out." Bumpy didn't answer. He didn't have to. He reached into his vest pocket. The mobsters flinched, expecting a gun. But Bumpy didn't bring a gun. Guns are loud. Guns are messy. He pulled out a straight razor with a pearl handle. He flicked it open. Snick. The sound was sharper than a whip crack. The three mobsters froze. They realized their mistake instantly. They had brought a contract to a knife fight. Bumpy took a step closer until he was looming over the desk. He looked at the man holding the pen, and then he looked at the sharks. He spoke softly, but his voice carried the weight of a judge passing a sentence. "Gentlemen," Bumpy said, "you seem to be confused. You think you're locking Joe Louis in here with you." He tapped the razor blade against the edge of the desk. "But the truth is, you're locked in here with me." Before we reveal exactly how Bumpy Johnson used a single razor blade to humiliate the Genovese family without spilling a drop of blood, hit that subscribe button. Because while the history books will tell you Joe Louis was the champion of the world, the streets know the truth. Even the champ needed a guardian angel. To understand why a gangster would risk a full-scale war to save a prizefighter, you have to understand the paradox of Harlem in 1940. It was a city split in two, a schizophrenia of concrete and soul. By day, it was the capital of Black America, a place of struggle, dignity, and survival, where families crowded into tenements and fought for every inch of respect. But by night, Harlem became a playground for the white elite. They came in droves from downtown Manhattan. They stepped out of yellow checker cabs and private limousines, draped in furs and diamonds, looking for a walk on the wild side. They wanted to hear the jazz. They wanted to see the dancing. They wanted to taste the danger of the ghetto without actually touching the people who lived there. The Cotton Club was the crown jewel of this contradiction. It was a plantation with a cover charge. Duke Ellington led the band. Lena Horne sang the blues. The greatest black talent in the history of the world performed on that stage. But if you were a black resident of Harlem, unless you were a celebrity of the highest order, you couldn't walk through the front door. You couldn't sit at a table. You couldn't buy a drink. The ownership was strictly white. The mob ran the liquor. The mob ran the staff. And the mob collected the profits. And then there was Joe Louis, to the public. He was a god. When he knocked out Max Schmeling in 1938, he didn't just win a fight. He dismantled the Nazi myth of Aryan supremacy with his bare hands. In Harlem, he wasn't just loved, he was worshipped. Men touched the hem of his robe. Children shadowboxed in the alleys whispering his name. But gods bleed. And Joe Louis was bleeding money. Joe had a fatal flaw, one that the sharks in New York City could smell from miles away. He had a heart that was too big for his bank account. He paid for funerals of strangers. He bought houses for family members. He handed out cash to anyone with a sad story. He was the heavyweight champion of the world, generating millions of dollars in ticket sales, yet he was constantly liquidating assets just to pay his taxes. The Italian mob, specifically the Genovese faction, watched this with hungry eyes. They saw Joe Louis not as a national hero, but as a whale, a natural resource to be harvested. They knew they couldn't just rob him at gunpoint. That would bring down the heat of the entire NYPD and the FBI. No, they had to do something smarter. They had to make him give them his money. They concocted a scheme that was as brilliant as it was evil. They called it the Cotton Club expansion. The pitch was seductive. They approached Joe's camp with a proposal. The Cotton Club was opening new locations in Chicago and Los Angeles. They needed a face for the franchise. They told Joe that if he put up $50,000, which was essentially his entire liquid savings at the time, he wouldn't just be an investor. He would be an owner, a managing partner. They told him, "Joe, you'll be the first black man to own a piece of the Cotton Club. You'll integrate the business from the top down." It was exactly what Joe wanted to hear. He didn't just want to be a fighter. He wanted to be a businessman. He wanted equality. He wanted to own the stage he stood on. But it was a lie. There were, no new locations. The Expansion Fund was a shell company registered to a ghost address in New Jersey. The contract was designed as a bust-out, a classic mob maneuver where they take the initial investment, declare bankruptcy, and leave the partner liable for the debts. If Joe signed, he wouldn't own a club. He would own the mob's losses. They would have a legal claim to his future fight purses to recoup operational costs. They would effectively own the heavyweight champion of the world. Most people in Harlem saw the headlines. Bumpy Johnson saw the fine print. Bumpy was a criminal, yes. He ran the numbers racket. He controlled the gambling. He was a dangerous man who had sent more than a few men to the hospital or the morgue. But he was Harlem's dangerous man. He operated on a code that the Italians couldn't understand. Bumpy knew the Italians. He did business with Lucky Luciano. He knew that the Genovese family would sooner burn the Cotton Club to the ground than let a black man own 1% of it. When his spies told him about the meeting, about the exclusive opportunity Joe was signing that very afternoon, Bumpy didn't hesitate. He realized that Joe was walking into a slaughterhouse thinking it was a banquet. Bumpy could have stayed out of it. It wasn't his money. It wasn't his fight. But Bumpy understood symbols. He knew that if Joe Louis fell, Harlem fell. If the brown bomber became a puppet for the mafia, the spirit of the community would be broken. So Bumpy Johnson did what he always did. He decided to intervene. Not with a lawyer, not with the police. He decided to make a house call, and he decided to bring his favorite instrument of negotiation. In the underworld, there is a hierarchy of fear. A gun is scary, yes, but a gun is impersonal. A gun is a machine. A razor is intimate. A razor requires proximity. When a man pulls a knife in a locked room, he is sending a very specific message. I am not afraid to get close to you, and I am not afraid of your blood getting on my suit. Bumpy Johnson walked to the center of the room. He didn't rush. He moved with the terrifying calmness of a man who has already accepted the outcome of the violence before it even begins. He stopped at the edge of the scarred wooden desk. He placed his left hand flat on the wood, right next to the contract. He looked at Vincent, the man in the center seat, the man who, 10 seconds ago, thought he was the most powerful person in the room. Vincent was a made man in the Genovese family. He was used to people trembling in his presence, but looking up at Bumpy Johnson, Vincent realized he was no longer in New York. He was in Harlem, and in Harlem, Bumpy was the judge, jury, and executioner. Bumpy began to speak. He kept his voice low, almost a whisper. He didn't scream threats. He simply dismantled their lie. He told them exactly who they were. He recited the names of their shell companies. He listed the fake addresses in New Jersey. He quoted the exact paragraph in the contract, Section 7, subsection C, that would have stripped Joe Louis of his fortune. He asked Vincent if he thought Harlem was illiterate. He asked if they thought the people of this neighborhood were too stupid to recognize a bust-out scheme when they saw one. The air in the room grew heavy. Bumpy was stripping them naked, peeling away the businessman disguise, until there was nothing left but 3 common thieves. Frank, the muscle, made the mistake of thinking Bumpy was distracted. He twitched his hand toward his shoulder holster. Bumpy didn't turn. He didn't blink. He simply flicked his wrist. The blade moved faster than thought. It stopped exactly 1 inch from Frank's left eye. Bumpy held it there, perfectly still. He told Frank that if he wanted to reach for that gun, he could. But he promised Frank that before his hand touched the grip, he would be blind. Frank slowly moved his hand back to the table. He was breathing hard, sweat beading on his upper lip. With the physical threat neutralized, Bumpy turned to Joe. The champ looked like he had just woken up from a nightmare. The pen was still in his hand, hovering over the paper. The realization of what he had almost done was crashing down on him. Bumpy spoke to him gently. He told Joe to put the pen down. He told him that a man's signature is his soul. He told him that you can lose a fight in the ring and come back, but if you sign your freedom away to these men, there is no rematch. Joe dropped the pen. It clattered onto the desk, rolling away from the contract. Now it was time for the verdict. Bumpy offered the Italians a choice. It was a simple binary choice presented with the cold logic of a mathematician. Option 1. They could tear up that contract, right here, right now. They could rip it into pieces small enough to fit in the brass ashtray on the corner of the desk. Or, Option 2. Bumpy would use the razor in his hand to carve the word thief across their foreheads. He explained the consequences of Option 2. He told them he would throw them out onto 125th Street, bleeding and branded. He told them that every hustler, every numbers runner, and every legitimate businessman in New York would see the mark of shame on their faces. They would be ruined. They would be jokes. Vincent looked at Bumpy's eyes. He looked for a bluff. He looked for hesitation. He found none. Vincent realized that Bumpy Johnson was perfectly willing to go to prison for the rest of his life, just to make a point about respect. The silence stretched for 10 seconds. 10 seconds that felt like 10 years. Then, Vincent swallowed hard. His arrogance was gone. His power was gone. He reached out with a trembling hand and grabbed the Cotton Club expansion opportunity. He didn't sign it. He gripped the top of the page. And then he began to tear. The sound of that contract tearing was louder than any gunshot. Vincent ripped the document into halves, then quarters, then eighths. With every tear, the power dynamic in the room shifted. The Cotton Club expansion was reduced to a pile of worthless scrap paper. Vincent didn't look at Joe Louis. He couldn't. The shame was too total. He had walked into that room as a predator, and he was leaving as a scolded child. Bumpy watched the paper fall. He didn't gloat. He didn't smile. He simply stepped back to the door, reached into his pocket, and retrieved the key. He unlocked the door. He didn't shout, "Get out!" He didn't have to. The silence was the command. Vincent, Frank, and the paper pusher gathered their coats and scrambled into the hallway. They didn't look back. They walked down the stairs, out of the building, and into the humid Harlem night. They never returned to that office. They never tried to do business with Joe Louis again. And crucially, they never sought revenge against Bumpy Johnson. They knew that a man crazy enough to pull a razor on 3 armed mobsters was a man you didn't want to go to war with. When the door clicked shut, the adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a heavy, exhausting reality. Joe Louis sat there, staring at the torn paper. He looked up at Bumpy. The champion of the world looked young again, vulnerable. "I almost signed it," Joe whispered. "I thought it was my way out. I thought I was being smart." Bumpy walked over to the window and looked out at the street below. He didn't lecture Joe. He didn't shame him. He knew that the system was designed to make men like Joe fail. "They built the trap for you, Joe," Bumpy said quietly. "It wasn't your fault for walking into it. It was my job to make sure you walked out." Joe asked the question that had been burning in his chest. "Why? Why risk your life for my money?" Bumpy smiled, a rare, genuine smile. "I didn't do it for your money. In that ring, when you fight, you carry the weight of every black man and woman in this country. You fight for us. So out here, I fight for you." It was a simple exchange, but it sealed a bond that would last for decades. That afternoon in 1940 changed Joe Louis forever. He went on to defend his title 25 times. He became an American legend, and yes, tragedy still found him. The IRS pursued him relentlessly, a government mob that even Bumpy couldn't scare off. Joe died owing money, but he never died owning a master. He never fell for a street hustle again. He learned the lesson of the razor. The most dangerous enemies don't wear boxing gloves. They wear silk suits. And a man's signature is the most valuable thing he owns. As for Bumpy Johnson, he went back to the Lenox Lounge. He went back to running the numbers, settling disputes, and ruling the underworld. History calls him a gangster. The FBI called him a menace. But to the people of Harlem, and to the Brown Bomber, he was something else entirely. He was the razor that cut the strings. If this story of loyalty, betrayal, and power moved you, smash that like button and subscribe to this channel. It helps us tell more of these untold stories. And tell me in the comments, if you were in Bumpy's shoes, would you have let those men leave that room alive? Or would you have sent a permanent message to the Genovese family? I'm reading every comment. This is Untold Mafia Stories. Remember, in Harlem, respect isn't given, it's earned.